The plate didn't shatter loudly, but the sound of porcelain striking tile was sharp enough to silence the entire restaurant. "Which?" my daughter-in-law said, her voice steady, almost casual. "You should have never come." For a moment, no one moved. The waiter froze beside the table with a bottle of sparkling water in his hand. A couple across the room paused mid-conversation. Even the soft hum of clinking glasses and low jazz music seemed to fade into something distant and hollow. I remained seated, my spine straight against the velvet-backed chair, my linen napkin still resting neatly in my lap. The pasta I had barely touched now lay scattered across the polished floor, red sauce staining the white tile like a careless brushstroke. My son, Daniel, did not stand. He did not reach for me. He stared at the table as if studying the grain of the wood might offer him escape. The candle between us flickered, reflecting in the crystal wine glasses that Brittany had insisted we order. It was their 10th wedding anniversary dinner, held at La Verona, an upscale Italian restaurant downtown that required reservations weeks in advance. I had hesitated before accepting the invitation. The email had been brief, Daniel's name in the sender line, Brittany's tone in the wording. "We'd love for you to join us." Love felt like a generous word. Still, I had chosen my navy silk dress, the one with pearl buttons along the sleeve, and wrapped the silver bracelet I'd planned to give Brittany in cream-colored paper. I told myself this was a fresh start. Families survived misunderstandings. Families adjusted. When I arrived, Brittany had air-kissed my cheek without quite touching me. "You made it," she'd said, as though my presence were a mild inconvenience rather than an expectation. Throughout dinner, I noticed small things. My seat was placed slightly apart from theirs. Daniel avoided my eyes whenever I spoke. Brittany corrected the waiter twice about the wine selection, her voice clipped and precise. I kept my tone gentle, my smile restrained. I asked about their new house in Westchester, about the renovation plans, about the garden Brittany wanted. And then I made the mistake. I raised my glass and said, "To 10 years, and to the family legacy you're building together." The word legacy seemed harmless to me. It had always meant continuity, tradition, the passing down of love and memory. But Brittany's expression tightened. Her jaw stiffened. "Legacy," she repeated. The room felt smaller. "You don't get to talk about legacy," she said. And before I fully understood what was happening, her hand moved across the table and my plate was no longer in front of me. It met the floor in a quiet but decisive fall. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I folded my hands together and looked at her calmly. 71 years of living had taught me that dignity is not something anyone can strip from you unless you hand it over willingly. The whispers around us began to stir, low and curious. I reached for my handbag, not hurried, not trembling. If Brittany expected a scene, she would not get one. I stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "I see," I said, my voice even. Daniel finally looked up then, but he said nothing. And in that silence, I realized something far more important than a broken plate had just revealed itself. I walked out of La Verona without looking back, the cool evening air meeting my face like a quiet witness to what had just happened. The city lights along Main Street glowed softly against the dark sky, and the valet at the curb avoided my eyes as he handed me my car keys. I thanked him with the same steady tone I had used all evening. My hands did not shake as I unlocked my silver sedan. They did not tremble as I started the engine. Only when I adjusted the rearview mirror did I notice how pale I looked, as though something inside me had shifted into a colder, clearer place. I did not cry on the drive home. The traffic lights changed from red to green in slow, predictable rhythm, and I followed them through town, passing familiar storefronts, the closed bakery on the corner, the pharmacy where I refill my blood pressure medication every month. Everything looked the same, only I felt different. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light I had left on earlier cast a warm circle across the front steps. I sat in the car for a moment before going inside, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The silence was not heavy. It was instructive. Inside, the house greeted me with its usual stillness. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked 8:30. I set my handbag on the console table and carefully removed my heels, placing them side by side as I always do. Order matters. Routine steadies the mind. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink, staring out at the dark backyard where the maple trees moved gently in the night breeze. I replayed Brittany's face in my memory, not the anger, but the fear beneath it. Legacy had unsettled her. The word had struck something she did not want examined. I thought about the email invitation again, about the way it had arrived only 2 days before the reservation, about how Daniel had not called me directly. Small details that once felt insignificant now aligned themselves like puzzle pieces clicking into place. This was not a sudden outburst. It was a culmination. For years, I had noticed subtle adjustments in my place within their lives. Holiday dinners scheduled without confirming my availability. Decisions about family gatherings made after the fact. Photographs posted online where I appeared at the edge, never at the center. I had told myself it was modern life, that young couples create their own traditions. I had told myself not to be sensitive. Tonight stripped away that comfort. I walked into my living room and sat in the armchair beside the lamp my late husband had insisted on buying from an antique shop in Vermont. He used to say that light reveals truth if you sit with it long enough. I folded my hands in my lap and let the quiet settle around me. Brittany's accusation had not been about a plate or a toast. It had been about control, about who defines the story of a family and who is permitted to belong. Daniel's silence spoke louder than her insult. He had chosen not to intervene, not to stand, not to correct. And in that choice, he revealed where he believed his loyalty must rest. I did not feel rage. Rage is loud and unproductive. What I felt was clarity. I rose from the chair and walked down the hallway to my home office, where the mahogany desk still held neatly organized folders. In the top drawer rested documents that Daniel had never bothered to review in detail, papers that reflected investments made long before Brittany entered our lives. I did not open them yet. I simply rested my hand on the drawer handle and considered the weight of what it contained. Respect, once withdrawn, does not return easily. But accountability has a way of introducing itself at precisely the right time. And as I stood there in the quiet glow of the desk lamp, I understood that tonight had not diminished me. It had clarified my position. The broken plate was only the beginning. I did not open the drawer that night. Instead, I returned to the kitchen, rinsed my glass, and placed it carefully on the drying rack as though nothing in my world had shifted. Discipline has always been my anchor. When my husband passed away 12 years ago, I survived by keeping structure intact. Bills were paid on time. Investments were reviewed every quarter. The lawn was trimmed every other Saturday, even if I had to hire someone to do it. Order prevents collapse. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the dining room curtains at precisely 7:15, the way it always does in early spring. I brewed my coffee, measured 2 tablespoons of grounds exactly, and carried the mug to the table where I usually read the financial section of the newspaper. The headlines were predictable. Markets rising. Interest rates adjusting. Restaurants expanding downtown. I paused at that last word. Expanding. La Verona had announced plans for a second location just 3 months earlier. Daniel had mentioned it briefly during a phone call, his voice filled with cautious optimism. We are thinking of investing more, he had said. I had asked a few practical questions about overhead costs and projected revenue. Brittany had taken the phone then, laughing lightly. Do not worry, Eleanor. We have it handled. I remember how that sentence lingered long after the call ended. We have it handled. As though experience were an inconvenience rather than an asset. I finished my coffee and walked to the office again. This time, I opened the drawer. The folder inside was thick, organized in chronological order. Years ago, when Daniel decided to invest in the restaurant, he did not qualify for the full business loan on his own. His credit was good, but not extensive. I had co-signed the initial agreement and secured it with a portion of my retirement portfolio. Not because he asked, but because I offered. A mother believes she is strengthening the foundation for her child. The documents were clear. My name remained on the primary guarantee. Any restructuring or expansion required my written consent. I traced my finger along the signature line where my name appeared beside Daniel's. Brittany's name was not there. She had married into the venture, but she did not build its base. I leaned back in the chair and allowed the realization to settle. Legacy was not just a sentimental word. It was documented, structured, legal. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Daniel's name illuminated the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded strained, controlled. Mom, about last night. I waited. Silence has weight when you let it. Brittany was stressed, he continued. You know how important appearances are in that place. Appearances. I glanced at the folder still open on my desk. I understand how important foundations are, I replied evenly. He exhaled slowly, as though the conversation were an inconvenience. We will talk soon, he said, and ended the call without offering an apology. I set the phone down gently. The pattern was undeniable now. Invitations extended late. Respect offered conditionally. Accountability avoided entirely. Brittany feared legacy because legacy implied permanence, and permanence implied influence beyond her control. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer, not with anger, but with precision. A reaction would have satisfied them. Outrage would have given them something to dismiss. Instead, I would give them time. Time to consider the weight of silence. Time to wonder what I might be reviewing behind a closed office door. I rose, straightened my blazer, and stepped outside onto the porch. The maple trees were bright with new leaves, sunlight catching their edges in quiet brilliance. Nothing about the day appeared dramatic. Yet beneath its calm surface, leverage had shifted. And this time, I would not ignore it. 2 days passed without another call. I did not reach out, and neither did they. Silence, when intentional, unsettles people more than confrontation ever could. On Wednesday morning, I drove downtown just after 9, parking in the public garage across from La Verona. I had no reservation. I had no announcement. I simply walked in through the front entrance the way I had many times before, when the restaurant was still an empty shell with exposed brick and folding chairs scattered across the floor. Back then, Daniel had stood in the center of the room with blueprints rolled under his arm, his voice full of ambition and uncertainty. It is a risk, he had admitted. And I had answered without hesitation. Most worthwhile things are. I remembered writing the first check at my kitchen table, carefully reviewing the numbers before signing my name. I remembered sitting with the bank manager, clarifying terms, ensuring protections were in place. Not because I doubted my son, but because experience teaches caution. Inside the restaurant now, the lunch crowd was thin. A hostess recognized me and offered a polite nod. Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Respect still existed here, even if it had grown selective at my own table. I asked to speak with Mr. Alvarez, the general manager. He arrived within minutes, wiping his hands on a neatly folded towel. His expression shifted from surprise to concern when he saw me. Is everything all right? He asked. Everything is clear, I replied. Clarity, I have learned, often precedes change. We sat in a corner booth away from the windows. I did not mention Brittany's behavior. I did not describe the plate or the word she used. Instead, I asked measured questions about the expansion plans, about projected construction timelines, about financing structures. Mr. Alvarez answered carefully. When he referenced the new loan application, I noted the detail. Has the restructuring paperwork been finalized? I asked. He hesitated. We are waiting on one signature. I held his gaze steadily. He did not need to specify whose signature that was. I thanked him for his time and stood to leave. On my way out, I paused near the bar, running my fingers lightly across the polished wood. Daniel had chosen this exact finish after 3 weeks of deliberation. He had wanted it to feel substantial, permanent. Outside, the spring air carried the scent of fresh pavement and blooming trees. I did not feel anger. I felt alignment. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from Daniel, brief and carefully worded. We need to finalize documents for the expansion. Can you come by tomorrow to sign? There was no mention of dinner. No acknowledgement of what had occurred. Just logistics. I read the message twice before closing my laptop. It was not an apology they sought. It was authorization. That evening, as I prepared a simple dinner of grilled salmon and steamed vegetables, I considered the sequence of events. Brittany's outburst had not been emotional instability. It had been calculation born of insecurity. She feared influence she could not control. She feared that my presence represented more than a mother at the table. It represented leverage. After dinner, I returned to the office once more and removed the folder again, this time placing it neatly inside my leather briefcase. I added a pen, my reading glasses, and a small notepad. No raised voices would be necessary. No dramatic declarations. Documentation speaks more clearly than indignation ever could. I turned off the desk lamp and stood in the dim light for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house around me. Tomorrow would not be about revenge. It would be about boundaries. And boundaries, when calmly enforced, reshape relationships more effectively than any argument. I arrived at the restaurant the next morning precisely at 10 o'clock, my briefcase resting neatly against my side, my steps measured and unhurried. The dining room was quiet at that hour, chairs still inverted on a few tables, sunlight spilling through the tall front windows and illuminating the polished floors. Daniel was already seated in the back office when I entered, sleeves rolled up, a stack of documents spread before him. Brittany stood near the filing cabinet, arms crossed, her posture composed but rigid. She did not offer a greeting. Daniel looked up first. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. His tone was neutral, businesslike, as though the dinner 2 nights prior had been a minor inconvenience already filed away. I set my briefcase down gently and took my seat. "You said there were documents that required my signature," I replied. He slid a packet across the desk, pages clipped and flagged with yellow tabs. "It is just the restructuring for the expansion. Standard procedure." Standard is a flexible word. I adjusted my glasses and began reading line by line, not skimming, not rushing. The office was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjacent prep area. Brittany shifted her weight once, then again. "It is straightforward," she said finally. "The sooner we finalize, the sooner construction begins." I continued reading. The revised agreement extended the loan terms, increased the financial exposure, and most notably, diluted the original guarantee structure. My name remained present, but the protections were altered. Liability without equivalent authority. I closed the packet carefully and folded my hands on top of it. "When did you decide to change the guarantee framework?" I asked calmly. Daniel blinked. "It is just modernization," he said. "It makes things simpler." Simpler for whom was the unspoken question. I turned one of the pages back toward him and tapped the paragraph outlining consent requirements. "This clause removes my approval authority on future capital decisions," I said evenly. Brittany stepped forward. "That is because you do not need to be involved in operational details," she replied, her voice controlled but tight. "It is our business." I met her gaze without hostility. "It was built on my signature," I answered. The room stilled. Daniel rubbed his forehead. "Mom, we are not trying to push you out," he said. "We just need flexibility. Flexibility without accountability is a fragile arrangement." I opened my briefcase and removed the original agreement, placing it beside the new packet. The contrast was clear. "The initial structure protected all of us," I said. "This one protects you while increasing my exposure." Brittany's composure flickered. "You think we would ever put you at risk?" she asked. I held her eyes for a moment longer than comfort allowed. "I think decisions reveal priorities," I replied. Silence pressed against the walls. Outside, a delivery truck reversed with a soft beeping sound, then faded. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "What are you saying?" he asked. I slid the unsigned packet back across the desk. "I am saying I will not sign this version," I answered. No raised voice. No accusation. Just fact. Brittany's jaw tightened. "Then the expansion stalls," she said. I nodded once. "Until a structure is presented that reflects mutual respect." The word hung in the air. Respect. It had been absent at dinner. It would not be absent here. Daniel looked between us, calculation overtaking discomfort. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. I closed my briefcase and stood. "A revision that restores shared authority," I said. "And clarity going forward." I paused at the door before leaving. "Legacy is not removed by dropping a plate," I added softly. "It is reinforced by how we conduct ourselves afterward." I walked out into the sunlight without waiting for a response. Behind me, the future of their expansion no longer felt guaranteed. And for the first time since that evening at La Verona, I sensed the balance shifting not with anger, but with intention. The call came the following afternoon, not from Daniel, but from Brittany. Her name appeared on my screen at precisely 3:12, the timing deliberate enough to suggest preparation. I let it ring once before answering. "Eleanor," she said, her voice controlled, almost rehearsed. She did not use Mom. She rarely did. "We need to resolve this quickly. Contractors are waiting." I sat at my dining table with a legal pad in front of me, sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor in long, quiet lines. "Resolution requires alignment," I replied calmly. There was a pause, the faint sound of her exhale traveling through the line. You are making this more complicated than it needs to be, she said. Complicated is often what people call boundaries when they encounter them for the first time. The structure protects everyone, I answered. That is not complication. That is balance. Her tone sharpened slightly. Daniel feels blindsided. I glanced toward the hallway where framed photographs lined the wall. Images of Daniel at 5 years old holding a baseball glove nearly as large as his torso. Daniel at 16 learning to drive in the family sedan. Daniel at 25 shaking hands with his first investor. I had stood behind him quietly in every one of those moments. Being surprised by accountability is different from being wronged, I said evenly. Silence followed. I could sense calculation on the other end of the call. Brittany was accustomed to controlling tone, controlling narrative. This time she was negotiating with something less emotional and more durable. What exactly are you asking for? She said finally. I turned a page on my legal pad, though I had already outlined my terms earlier that morning. Restoration of shared approval authority on major financial decisions, I replied. Transparent reporting on expansion costs. And acknowledgement that I remain a principal guarantor. The word acknowledgement carried more weight than the others. This is not about ego, I continued. It is about structure. Brittany's composure wavered just slightly. You are still upset about dinner, she said. I allowed a brief pause before answering. I am attentive to patterns, I corrected gently. The distinction mattered. She inhaled slowly. If we adjust the language, will you sign? She asked. Conditional respect is rarely sustainable, but progress often begins with terms. If the language reflects mutual authority and not selective liability, I will review it, I said. I did not promise more. After the call ended, I remained seated for a few minutes, listening to the quiet ticking of the clock above the doorway. The house felt steady. Outside, a neighbor walked his golden retriever along the sidewalk, the leash slack and relaxed. Balance is visible when it exists. Later that evening, Daniel called. His voice was softer this time, less defensive. Mom, we can revise it, he said. Maybe we moved too fast. I did not say I told you so. I did not recount the plate or the word she used. Speed is not the issue, I replied. Foundation is. He was quiet for a moment. I should have handled dinner differently, he added, almost reluctantly. It was not a full apology, but it was a shift. Handling things differently begins now, I answered. The conversation ended without tension. Not warm. Not distant. Adjusted. I closed my notebook and placed it back inside my desk drawer. Progress does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters through revision lines in a contract. Sometimes it arrives through a son who finally understands that silence has consequences. I stood and turned off the dining room light as evening settled outside the windows. The situation was not resolved, but it was no longer one-sided. And that distinction changed everything. The revised draft arrived by email the next morning at 8:43, attached without commentary, as though contracts revised themselves overnight without influence or pressure. I printed the document and laid the pages across my dining table, aligning the corners with deliberate precision before reading a single line. Outside, a light rain tapped gently against the windows, steady and unhurried, the kind of rain that suggests patience rather than urgency. I began at the top, scanning each paragraph carefully. The approval clause had been restored. Major capital decisions required dual consent once again. Reporting language had been expanded to include quarterly disclosures with full transparency. My liability remained proportionate to my authority. It was not generosity that had reshaped the document. It was recognition. I finished reviewing the final page and allowed myself a slow breath, not of relief, but of confirmation. Boundaries, when calmly enforced, alter behavior. Around noon, Daniel called. Did you see the revision? He asked. His voice sounded measured, neither defensive nor overly warm. I did, I replied. It reflects the original structure more accurately. There was a brief pause. We should have approached this differently, he said. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging misjudgment without framing it as inconvenience. Structure protects relationships, I answered. It prevents misunderstandings. He exhaled, a sound of quiet concession. Can you come by this afternoon to finalize? I agreed without embellishment. When I arrived at the restaurant later that day, the atmosphere felt different. The staff greeted me with the same respectful nods as before, but there was an undercurrent of attentiveness now. as though the building itself recognized that something foundational was being recalibrated. Daniel met me in the back office again, but this time Brittany was already seated, the revised packet neatly stacked in front of her. She stood when I entered. The gesture was subtle, but intentional. "Thank you for reviewing it," she said. Her tone was controlled, but no longer sharp. I took my seat and read through the final draft once more, confirming that the language matched what I had reviewed earlier. When I reached the signature line, I removed my pen from my briefcase and paused briefly before signing. Not to dramatize the moment, but to acknowledge its weight. My name settled onto the paper with steady ink. Daniel signed next, then Brittany. The order mattered. Once the pages were gathered, Daniel looked at me carefully. "We want you involved," he said. The statement carried both sincerity and strategy. "Involvement requires respect," I replied calmly. Brittany's gaze met mine for a moment longer than before. "The expansion will move forward next week," she said. I nodded. "Then let it be built on clarity." There was no mention of dinner. No direct apology. Yet something had shifted. The dynamic was no longer assumed. It was negotiated. After the documents were filed, I walked through the dining room once more before leaving. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating polished tables set for the evening crowd. I paused near the bar again, running my fingertips across the smooth wood Daniel had once chosen so carefully. Permanence requires maintenance. Authority requires awareness. As I stepped outside into the damp, cool air, I did not feel triumphant. I felt balanced. The insult at dinner had not been erased. It had been contextualized. A plate dropped in public may attempt to diminish someone, but authority, properly documented and calmly asserted, cannot be dismissed so easily. And as I drove home beneath the gray sky, I understood that the foundation of La Verona was no longer something they assumed I would support without question. It was something they now understood I could withhold. That knowledge, quiet and firm, had changed the air between us more than any argument ever could. The week that followed moved quietly, almost deceptively so. Construction crews began arriving early each morning at La Verona, their trucks lining the curb before the lunch service began. I drove by once on Tuesday, not to supervise, but to observe. Temporary fencing had been installed along the side entrance, and a banner announcing the upcoming expansion hung neatly across the brick facade. It looked ambitious, confident. I parked across the street and watched for a few minutes as workers carried lumber and equipment through the side doors. Daniel stood near the entrance speaking with a contractor, clipboard in hand. He looked focused, determined. For the first time in months, I saw not a man caught between voices, but a man aware of structure. Later that afternoon, he stopped by my house unannounced. He had not done that in years. I was in the kitchen slicing apples when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, he stood there with his hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched as though bracing for cold air. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. It was not entirely true, but it was an effort. I invited him inside. We sat at the dining table where I had reviewed so many documents over the years. He glanced around the room, perhaps noticing details he had overlooked before, the polished wood floors, the framed photographs, the quiet order of the space that had shaped his childhood. "The contractors are impressed with the new layout," he said after a moment. I nodded. "Clarity improves outcomes," I replied. He gave a small, almost reluctant smile. The conversation drifted to practical matters at first, timelines, budgets, supply costs that had increased by nearly 12% since last year. But then his tone shifted. "Brittany did not handle dinner well," he said carefully. It was not a full apology, but it was the first direct acknowledgement of what had happened. I placed the knife down beside the cutting board and folded my hands together. "Moments reveal priorities," I answered calmly. He stared at the tabletop for a long second. "She felt threatened," he admitted quietly. There it was. Not anger. Not accusation. Fear. "By a word?" I asked gently. He shook his head. "By influence." The honesty surprised him as much as it did me. I let the silence settle between us. Not heavy, but reflective. "Influence is not competition," I said. "It is contribution." He nodded slowly. "I am beginning to understand that," he replied. We did not dwell on it further. Some realizations require space to mature. Before leaving, he stood near the doorway and hesitated. "We are hosting a small preview dinner for investors next month," he said. "I would like you there." The phrasing mattered. Not "you can come." Not if you want. I would like you there. I held his gaze steadily. If the invitation reflects respect, I will attend, I answered. He nodded once and stepped outside. As I closed the door, I felt no surge of victory. What I felt was recalibration. Boundaries had been set, and now behavior was adjusting to accommodate them. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The broken plate from that night at La Verona had not been replaced in my memory, but it no longer defined the narrative. It had revealed imbalance. An imbalance, once recognized, can be corrected. Outside, the early spring air carried the faint scent of rain again, steady and patient. Foundations endure storms not because they avoid them, but because they are built to withstand pressure. And as the days moved forward, I sensed that something more enduring than resentment was taking shape. Not forgiveness yet, not warmth, but respect, deliberate and unmistakable, settling back into place. The investor preview dinner arrived on a Thursday evening, nearly 4 weeks after the contracts were revised. The restaurant looked different, brighter, more expansive, the newly opened side room softly lit with warm amber fixtures that reflected against the polished floors. A banner near the entrance read "Private Event" in understated gold lettering. I chose a charcoal gray dress this time, simple and tailored, and a single strand of pearls. Presentation is not vanity. It is composure. When I stepped inside, Daniel greeted me at the door before any host could intervene. "I am glad you came," he said, his voice steady. He held my gaze without looking away. That detail did not go unnoticed. Brittany approached moments later. Her expression was measured, her posture composed. "Thank you for being here, Eleanor," she said. The phrasing was deliberate, not casual, not dismissive. I inclined my head slightly. "It is important to see things built properly," I replied. The dining room hummed with quiet conversation, investors seated at linen-covered tables, glasses catching the light. I recognized a few faces from earlier years, men and women who had once sat across from me at the bank discussing risk assessments and collateral structures. This time, introductions were handled differently. "This is my mother, Eleanor Whitmore," Daniel said to one couple, his tone clear. "She was instrumental in launching La Verona." Instrumental. The word carried weight. I noticed Brittany standing beside him, not correcting, not redirecting. During the first course, Daniel stood to address the room. He spoke about growth projections, community impact, projected revenue increases of 18% over the next fiscal year. He mentioned risk mitigation strategies and thanked the investors for their confidence. Then he paused briefly. "I also want to acknowledge the foundation that allowed this expansion to happen," he said. His eyes found mine across the room. Strong partnerships matter. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was structural. Brittany met my gaze from across the table later in the evening. There was no hostility there now, only calculation tempered by understanding. When dessert was served, she leaned slightly toward me. "The revisions were necessary," she said quietly. It was as close to admission as she would offer. "So was the clarity," I answered. She nodded once. No defensiveness, just acknowledgement. The evening progressed without incident. No raised voices. No broken plates. Only measured conversations and contracts resting securely in their proper framework. As guests began to leave, Daniel walked me toward the entrance. "I should have intervened that night," he said softly, not looking at the floor this time, but at me directly. The statement hung between us, neither elaborate nor evasive. "Intervention is less important than correction," I replied. He absorbed that in silence. Outside, the air was cool and clean, the streetlights casting steady halos onto the pavement. I paused before stepping toward my car. "Legacy is not about control," I said quietly. "It is about continuity with integrity." Daniel nodded, the words settling in a place that felt permanent. I drove home beneath a clear sky, not with a sense of triumph, but with equilibrium. The incident at dinner had not vanished from memory, but it had been absorbed into something larger, a recalibration of respect and authority. In the quiet of my home later that night, I removed my pearls and placed them carefully in their box. Dignity does not shout. It does not demand applause. It simply remains intact when tested. And sometimes, that is the strongest statement of all.